Good evening. Welcome to Friends. Pascal, welcome Robert on This is Revolution podcast. Welcome. I'm your host for this evening, and we are interested in having, we're going to be having a wonderful show tonight with our guests discussing what is going on in Argentina. And we have again with us our voice of reason, the wonderful one and only M. Toussaint.
Hello,
M. Toussaint, are
hello.
you with us?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Good to be
Absolutely.
here. How are you tonight?
Doing okay, doing okay.
Glad to hear it.
So we're going to be going another episode of This is Revolution. If you're new to the channel, welcome. Glad you have come here. If you like what we're doing, please hit your like and subscribe. It's a passive gesture that goes a long way. If you're a returning listener, glad you have your back. Our guest has an intriguing theory regarding the rise of Argentina's far right Democratic elected president Javier Milei. According to him, Milei's ascent is a direct result of the failure of Argentina's bourgeois intellectuals who have become so disconnected from the poor and working class that their ineptitude created a void in a political apathetic moment in this place for counterpunch. Our guest writes, so, who killed politics in Argentina? Milei was elected based on pre-existing anti-political sentiment. He first went viral as an anti-state commentator during the pandemic when Argentina had the longest lockdowns of the Western Hemisphere under Alberto Fernandez administration. It was during lockdown and just after that the Argentina Alliance of pro-labor parties, overconfident after the humiliating defeat of Mazurio Macri's conservative movement in 2019 began losing all internal coherence. Today, the Macri family and those families who are part of Macri cabal are back riding on the social media success of Milei's government. How did the center left go back to square one? And is this an omen for what will happen in upcoming U.S. elections? And why had a blander version of the Peronist center left regained office in the first place, only to be destroyed by Milei? That excerpt is from the article written by our guest tonight, Arturo Desimone, entitled Milei as Argentina Messe After the Failure of Intellectuals. Wherever you're listening or watching this program, you'll find links to the description in Arturo's piece. Please join me in welcoming Arturo Desimone.
Hi, yes. Um, uh,
Hello, Arturo. How are you?
Hello, how are you? What do you think?
So let's get to the questions. What are the key factors that led to Javier Milei's rise in Argentinian politics?
The key factors. A number of things. First of all, there is a sense of hopelessness because Peronism, which is the popular movement or the way of doing politics in Argentina, in the interests of the majorities for decades now. It has begun to change in some ways that are quite good, in other ways that are very unfortunate. And there was a crisis of faith because Peronism became very much accommodating of global financial firms like IMF. Peronism, even though there was no reason to do so, it began to imitate the formulas of failure of many of the rests of the Western left. So there's no reason really for a movement that has so much popular support and so many lucid thinkers to do the things that the Labour Party or the Democrats did, during the Clinton era. But they went down that road, and there was after the defeat of Mauricio Macri and the return of a Peronist, so center-left populist, government trying to do social democracy. After the return of Peronism through Alberto Fernandez's administration in 2019, there was then a lot of hope, many expectations. People couldn't stop celebrating because it was hard to imagine a worse social economic depression than the last years of the Mauricio Macri administration, even though Mauricio Macri's administration was hailed as a great step forward, as something very positive. Obama, who had been refusing to see Cristina Kirchner, visited Argentina to congratulate Mauricio Macri. His visit was greatly protested. And so there was a lot of hope with the exit of Macri, who had failed in terms of economics, who had failed in terms of protecting civil rights, who had damaged, civil liberties. He had damaged civil liberties. There was a lot of hope that that would be reversed in the 4 years of the Alberto Fernandez administration. Alberto Fernandez proposed many bold things. He also flirted with nationalizing a bankrupt and very corrupt major food producer. He had flirted with expropriating this food producer, a company called Vicentin, which was during a very crucial time after the pandemic or mid-pandemic, when there was a serious food insecurity in the country, and he failed to do so. He withdrew from all of the radical promises of Peronism, and he began to constantly try to present agreeing with the IMF as something very positive. He began to create a fantasy that the new head of the IMF, I sometimes confuse her name, Georgina Kristaleva, I think, is a very different person from Christine Lagarde, who, like many global financial interests, like many spokespersons of the Davos elite, are very much obsessed with Argentina. Argentina is an obsession has been an obsession for much of the Western financial establishment for years, namely because of the threat of secular economic nationalism always coming from the Peronists, and because the country is always a basket case with inflation. Adapting to inflation is part of the culture in Argentina. So it's a population that is small and highly educated, often very difficult to control because it's a population that adapts to financial crises very well. And so I don't know. I'm going off on. Tell me if I hit the nail on the head. I don't know.
No, not actually. Can you define the phenomenon? This is something that I've always found fascinating when discussing Argentina. Can you define the phenomenon of Peronism in a way our audience, can understand?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Peronism. I guess I shouldn't be afraid of repeating myself from what I said maybe at some point on the Sublation show. Anyway, Peronism is a mix of Peronism is secular economic nationalism. It's a popular movement that pretty much invented popular politics, popular political campaigning in Argentina, and before the rise of Peron, or before the mutation of the general Peron, because Peron was, like Chavez, he was a military man. But he apparently saw the lights. And so before Peron, there were many social movements in Argentina, particularly because of all the Italian anarchists and Italian socialists, also like my paternal ancestors, my great-grandfather and great-uncle. They were socialists and anarchists, who were imprisoned in the Arctic south of the country for anarchist activities, right? So these anarchist and socialist movements, they had all kinds of ideas about workers' rights. They had all kinds of projects, but these remained on a very small scale in terms of, pockets of rebellion and communes, and they tried to spread their ideas. But Argentina was a paradise for British investors who wanted exports of primary resources to England, meat, food, and primary resources. But it was somewhat of a purgatory, a hell for majority of people, for the immigrant laborers, for others, for people in the provinces who were more indigenous. There was no such thing as workers' rights. The average worker worked from Monday till Monday, 10 hours a day, and would be beaten, or in the industrial setting. And so Peron came along, and he managed to guarantee that there would not be any rebellion from the military if a popular movement, which was led by him and by his wife, Eva Peron, if a popular movement tried to implement these greatly desired things like workers' rights, like the things that were achieved with the Roosevelt era in the United States, were achieved in Argentina in the Peron era. So the weekends, a kind of, this kind of New Deal idea, because Argentina is also a country like the United States, where people went to escape feudalism. It's a country with very immense lands, fertile, and so the idea of I'm sorry, I forgot where I was. It was a kind of New Deal idea was possible in such a country, like the New Deal wouldn't have occurred to somebody in Europe. It occurred to people in the Americas, right? And so Peron implemented a kind of New Deal politics in Argentina, but the big difference, of course, is that Roosevelt was, of course, from the aristocracy, and Peron was from the Praetorian Guard, from the people who protected the interests of the landowning aristocracy. Peron was a military man, but he was a military man who, like Chavez, more recently, he would read a whole eclectic mix of books and had many ideas. Sometimes he felt he was a socialist. Sometimes he identified more with the right wing in Europe. But he decided to force through things like workers' rights, taxations, secular nationalisms, protectionism, the weekend, and things like that, which socialists and Marxists are right to be very critical of in a way. I mean, these are things that pacify and mollify and lull the masses in a way, and so that's been a Marxist critique of Peronism for a very long time. And another Marxist critique of Peronism. Well, you didn't ask me about that, so I won't go into that.
No, you can go ahead. You continue. What's been another? I'd like to hear what was the other Marxist critique.
Well, I mean, the left has been very the left and the Peronist left, in in Argentina, there's been a conflict between secular nationalism and Trotskyite movements. I'm not a part of any of these. This shirt is by accident. And the rest of my laundry was not clean. But there has long been a conflict between more left-wing groups that reject anything that really diverts from orthodoxy and Peronism. And partly it's because Perón, after he returned from exile, he was exiled in Spain, and his wife, his first wife, Eva Perón, who was kind of a pacifying force in Peronism, or civilizing force. Eva Perón, it's partly, maybe it's a legend or a myth, but she swung Peron a bit to the left. When he returned from exile, Eva Perón was no longer alive. His second wife was someone who was more reactionary and from the Spain of the Franco era, from the Madrid of the Franco era. And so he began to persecute leftists. He began to try to purge what he saw as a Marxist infiltration in the Peronist movement, and to hunt them down. And so this is something that's been largely, people have tried to not talk too much about this within the Peronist movement, to forget about it. And so this is a cause of many conflicts. Another cause of many conflicts is, of course, that Trotskyites are extremely doctrinaire, and they don't accept anything in the left that diverges from the formulas of Trotskyism. And Perón, of course, was a very heterodox way of implementing many programs that had been championed by the left, but which the left was not able to enact. Somewhat like, a leftist supporting today, or FK Jr., who's obviously not left-wing, but maybe he stands for some things that are left-wing. Maybe that's a bad comparison. I don't know.
All right, excellent. How did Milei anti-state commentary during the pandemic contribute to his popularity? How did his anti-statism contribute to his popularity?
Well, that began, I think, during the lockdown. I think during the lockdowns, Milei's videos began to circulate a great deal. Milei had made television appearances. He was a screaming. I'm a bit distracted by the comments that I see. That's okay.
Don't read the chat. Don't read the chat.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to maximize the screen for now. I can. Okay, now it's good. So Milei was always around. He was always trying to get attention for his ideas, and in a way, he sincerely pursued his ideas. He is sincere, just as many people who are insane are completely sincere. But he didn't have a lot of following until the pandemic, when his videos began to go viral, because that is when distrusts began to grow in the population towards the states, because people saw that those who worked in the states during the lockdowns, employees of the states had begun to resume their private lives before people who were not working for the state were allowed to resume their lives, return to work, return to recreation, which is very important in Argentina, to go outside. It was very easy it was very common to see people who maybe you were trying to email in the bureaucracy, who were ignoring your emails. You would see them suddenly in a bar, or you would see them enjoying certain privileges, also because their jobs and their private lives had resumed. And the time in the lockdown, Fernandez had come along promising to rebuild to rebuild the states, because the previous governments, like all anti-Peronist governments, Macri, what they try to do is they try to destroy particularly and specifically the progressive arms of the state, so the social programs they try to dismantle, but they, of course, encourage the growth and the strength of the police and of the military. Although Macri was not very, I mean, he lost an entire submarine, a whole submarine went missing during his administration. But usually the anti-Peronist right, they encourage the growth of the repressive apparatus of the state, but they descale those aspects of government that protect society. And so suddenly people found themselves under a lockdown in which officials were extremely smug, because what happened was that there was a false presumption made by officials and supporters and activists of the entire Peronist left. They made the assumption that had Macri not been humiliated and defeated when he attempted re-election, had he won a second term, they assumed he would have mishandled the pandemic in the exact same way that Bolsonaro did. They assumed, and this was a common, I don't want to use the word trope, but this was like a consensus idea. Everyone said we have to be the opposite in Argentina of what Bolsonaro is doing, because the anti-Peronists would want to do what Bolsonaro is doing in Brazil, which was to handle the pandemic very badly, to pretend it was a lie, to pretend it was a Masonic conspiracy, that it wasn't real. And of course, they ignored that Macri has a very different ideology than Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro is, you don't have to, I greatly dislike Bolsonaro, but whatever you want to say about Bolsonaro, he fits in better with this heterodox new right, which includes people like Milei, which includes people like Trump, Marine Le Pen, whereas Macri was more like Macron, or more like Joe Biden, or more like Obama, in that he believed in the neoliberalism with some politically correct language, say some nice things about gender, but be very repressive towards protesters and be ruthless in discarding, a big part of the population, poor people. And he was more like the mainstream right. Macri was like the mainstream right. And I believe that had Macri, this is what if history, but I believe had Macri won re-election, he would have simply exploited the pandemic for its authoritarian potential, just like Benjamin Netanyahu did, or just like Emmanuel Macron did. He exploited the pandemic in order to do more surveillance than necessary. And so the left in Argentina decided to constantly talk about, to constantly shame people who would, question that they suddenly didn't have a livelihood anymore, including a huge number of people who are informal workers, were being shamed and were being humiliated for complaining about their lack of well-being and their mental health during the pandemic. And especially Milei got popular in poor neighborhoods where the space to move around during a lockdown is more limited. And so people gathered around their phone watching Milei talk a lot. And also Milei is seen as a contrarian to the turn towards identity politics. Peronism, during the Kirchner era, so Nestor Kirchner, he was the one who was the leader of the force that built back Argentina. I don't want to sound like, build back better, but he was, after the 2001 meltdown, right, which was a financial crisis that was quite terrible in Argentina, that led to the country was on the brink of famine. Then Nestor Kirchner began to build back the country, the government. There was after a very dramatic time when people were talking about even splitting the country up into smaller countries, the Patagonian Republic or whatever. And so the Kirchner era transformed many aspects of Peronism. And very more relevant for this discussion, the Kirchner brand of Peronism was able to reach the middle class, the urban middle classes. And traditionally, urban middle classes did not like Peronism. Traditionally, urban middle classes felt that military dictatorships were better for their security. And urban middle classes began to get more keyed up towards progressive ideas, like mostly about feminism and so on, since there's been a tremendous emancipation of the Argentine woman since the 70s and since especially after the end of the dictatorship and the return of democracy. And so that's for good reason popular. But of course, it's a way of, Peronism adopted a lot of gender and identity politics. Also, non-binary gender theories became unquestionable, and there was a quest to find minorities in order to put identity politics more at the center, and this began to, I think, to alienate part of the population that lived in the provinces of the country, in the more Catholic and more conservative provinces, and they also felt that while there was reorientation towards identity politics, there was also an embrace of austerity. Peronists like Alberto Fernandez began to embrace and flirt with austerity a lot. And also Cristina Kirchner, who is seen as a reincarnation of Eva Perón. She has a very strange way of choosing her successors. She always chooses, she's tired of being politically persecuted, which she is, by lawfare in the country. And she is often a very tough politician. She endured an assassination attempt, shrugged it off almost like it was nothing. But whenever it's time for Cristina Kirchner to pick a successor to run for presidential election, she doesn't choose a radical person. So, for example, there was a young man from the north of the country, Randazzo, who wanted to rebuild the railways in Argentina, which were destroyed during the 1990s by the neoliberal presidency. The president who said his name is said to be unmentionable. If you mention the name Carlos Menem, you're supposed to touch your left testicle or your left breast if you're a woman, because it's bad luck. It's like, right? He's the one who sold much of the country in the 1990s. He's the one who caused the major speculations crisis that culminated in 2001, which was what 2008 was maybe for you, 2001 was for Argentina. And so, except that it happens, at a much more devastating pace. And so, what that president did, he sold all the railways of the country for scrap metal, and that led to very dangerous forms of transportation and very isolated little villages that are just deteriorating or depopulating. And so a young man called Randazzo came along in the Peronist movement saying his big cause was to rebuild the railways. He was, and Cristina Kirchner humiliated this politician and instead chose her successor, which would be Scioli, who was a neoliberal, who was from the 90s neoliberal administration. And so that is never questioned. There's a kind of leader worship in Peronism. There's a kind of genuflection before the hierarchy of Peronist authority. And so after the disasters of recent elections, people have begun to question Peronism and to think of maybe implementing a kind of an anarcho-Peronism, that we need to question these hierarchies in the country. So I think was that clear or not so much?
No, I appreciate you. In your article, you argue that the failure of Argentina's bourgeois intellectuals contributed to Milei's rise. Can you elaborate on how they connect? from the working class created that political vacuum?
Well, there are many, many examples of that. I wrote an article in Compact before they hired some Miami guy to write about Latin America, but about that. Well, maybe doesn't need to be mentioned. But one example I mentioned in that article is about so-called gender-neutral language, which is very unpopular because it's a way of, in Spanish, a huge amount of words are determined by grammatical gender, right? Some words end with an O sound, some with an A sound. My personal theory is that gendered language actually it affirms the existence of women more than gender-neutral languages, because I speak one gender-neutral language, But anyway, this theory became very popular. The Latinx thing became very popular among bourgeois intellectuals, who are people who can take their high culture for granted, because if you live in Buenos Aires has more bookstores than Paris. So if you're from Argentina, you've been bombarded with and you're from the middle class, then you've been bombarded with high culture in your language your whole life. And so then it's very easy to say, well, fuck the language. Let's just destroy the language and let's replace, this is a sexist, inferior, shitty language. And we'll replace all the O's and all the vowel sounds of little X's, of little E's. That sounds more like Catalan. And so this created a kind of alienation and linguistic trauma, because, like, I'm sure you followed Norman Finkelstein, in his political commentary, like his critique of the BDS movement, right? So Norman Finkelstein, when he critiques, when he gives his constructive critique of Western pro-Palestinian solidarity movements, he says you have to separate sects from policies that you will push in the public arena that will unify people. You separate sectarian ideas that are for your in-group, your political in-group. So he gives the example of Gandhi, right? Gandhi had some very crazy ideas that he imposed on people in his religious organizations. But he didn't impose those ideas. Like, he told people how to shave. He told people they couldn't watch films. But he didn't impose those ideas on the vast majority of the population of India, because he wanted to unite people, right? And so Peronism became very sectarian, where suddenly before a mass audience, somebody would be speaking in gender-neutral language, and anyone who didn't get into it, or who didn't get on the train with that, was seen as a reactionary, as a fascist, as an idiot, and was shamed, and so on. And for example, one girl from the very popular writer, who's Mayra Arena, who's from the slums, Bahia Blanca, a working class activist, she questioned this ideological change in the Peronist movement. She said the Peronist movement has gone to the right on economic and fiscal issues, but to the left on the social, sexual, moral issues. And immediately the Minister of Genders, Diversity and Feminism, Elizabeth Gomez Alcorta, who's also a member of the Progressive International, one of Yanis Varoufakis' organizations, she tweeted at this young popular activist that she is saying things that sound like the neo-Nazi right of the Bolsonaro movement. And it's awful, right? I mean, if you're part of a movement also that's speaking in the name of defending people from, the marginalized sectors of society, to then rubbish them the moment they say how they feel about these policies. I don't mean to, and also, like, in Argentina, it's very hard to find a newspaper that's, seriously covering the human rights trials, because the human rights trials against generals from the 1970s are ongoing, and they're still searching for people who have disappeared. And so suddenly they would use gender-neutral language to talk about victims of the disappearances or young men who died in the Malvinas War, and they would write about these. So the conservative parents of young men who died meaningless deaths in the idiotic war for the Malvinas or Falklands, for these islands, these conservative parents would suddenly read something in gender-neutral language about the cause of their children, and they'd feel alienation from that. So that was one issue. Also, a lot of cancel culture began to be promoted at the same time that there was a constant scaling back of the defense of interests that were more appealing to the working class. I'm not saying that the working class would be hostile to gender issues, not at all. Feminism can be very, very popular. Women's issues are rightly very, very popular. But the way this was done was to always take a very academic, sectarian slant, and to use the politics that are prominent in the first world, in the United States and in Europe, to punish people for wrong speak while doubling down on economic promises. Which is not to say that sexual and women's issues are not rightly very popular, but the way this was done created a lot of animosity. That's like for example, there's a law in Argentina. I think it's fallen into disuse. There's a law against symbolic violence, and I think in a country where it has a history of dictatorship, that's very problematic to have a law against something like symbolic violence. But that was fought for by progressives, and that can be misused by the right wing to call for censorship of controversial imagery in public spaces. So that's part of my diagnosis. I know I'm not giving very many very concrete examples, but I don't want to.
Would this be similar to the anti-woke phenomenon that we had in the United States that was being pushed by the right? This assumption that this kind of what they called a woke development that was coming out of intellectuals, and particularly the left, who had been invading society. Would this be similar to that kind of phenomenon?
Yeah, Milei is anti-woke. He's part of this. He's like Ron DeSantis. Yeah, but it's very dangerous though, because just like I guess in the United States, people don't distinguish between left and woke, and so in Argentina they don't distinguish between that either. And so many people who deny the crimes of the dictatorship identify as anti-woke, for example. Or in Argentina, for example, some of the social achievements for women are more like the more important ones are more similar to the second wave of feminism than the third wave of feminism. So, for example, the legalization of abortion, or the decriminalization of abortion, was in 2020, not in 1979. It was in 2020, right? So that is like wokeness, I think, is very, very dangerous, because we're not at that stage. We're not. I don't believe that we should be. I don't believe we are at that postmodern stage of history, and so genuine social achievements are conflated with performative politics in the way that will lead to throwing the baby out of the bathwater. But yes, shortly, Milei is anti-woke. Yes, he's anti-woke, and he's supported by some anti-woke activists. Indeed. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Feel free to interrupt me if I'm, if I'm going off.
No.
Cul-de-sac or whatever.
So I wanted to ask you, how exactly did the long lockdowns, you mentioned that, but you talked about it in detail, but can you go into the way the pandemic also, and the sentiment about the pandemic gives rises to Milei? What role did social media also play during this period in giving rise to Milei?
Well, he's largely a social media phenomenon. Milei is an influencer. Right before he won the election, he posted a TikTok of himself raising his eyebrows a lot, and that went viral on TikTok. So he's really a master of TikTok, of social media. Before social media, he was just a screaming head on TV. And so I think also left-wing social media, the culture wars on social media helped Milei a great deal. So the mudslinging between progressives and the right wing, and also, for example, I mentioned in the article Rita Segato, who is a feminist anthropologist, who says that she understood how men function by working in prisons, in Brazilian prisons. She became a celebrity in Argentina before and the Alberto Fernandez years, but she was very important during the Alberto Fernandez years, and she was in a way indirectly part of that. She was like parallel to, or almost part of the administration. And during the lockdowns, she began to speak of a mothering state. So this repressive lockdown was like a maternal state that was nurturing. And so it was a policy very different from Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who was definitely to the left of Alberto Fernandez in Mexico. I'm not saying that AMLO I don't know what government made the right choices, frankly, I don't know of any government that was able to handle this pandemic well. I'm not really speaking to that, but this is how people experience it, pretty much. I mean, at least those who saw Milei as a liberator. So.
Interesting. So he's able to weaponize all of this frustration to turn it out into a social media phenomenon that helps galvanize his political rise.
Yeah, like Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, and like a few other bastards, yes. TikTok, absolutely.
You mentioned that the Argentina Alliance of pro-labor parties began losing internal coherence post-pandemic. What were the main causes of this fragmentation?
There's what I already mentioned, and there was controversy also about whether or not there was a whole debate raging within Peronism about whether or not to once again repay the debts to the IMF, because one of the great achievements of the Kirchner era, or what's seen as one of the great achievements, is that there was a massive debt with the IMF that was created by the military dictatorship, really, in the 70s. They created a major part of the debt. They used it mostly to accrue weaponry to tyrannize the population. That debt remains. And so it was important for the Kirchners to regain Argentina's self-determination in the economic system, to not be enchained in debt, whereas the right wing always wants Argentina to be in debt in order to, ironically, in order to have a good relationship, meaning an obedient one, to not be too freewheeling, and to have an obedient relationship with the West. And so the West, the North, or whatever you want to call it, the seats of power in the world. And so what happened was that there was as soon as Macri came into power, he loaned $45 billion from the IMF, which was the largest loan in history from the IMF of any country to date. And most of that money was funneled out in the form of capital flight. And so on the one hand, and so this was a cause for debate during the years of Fernandez, whether or not the country should endure all this skyrocketing inflation caused by having to pay back the IMF debt. Of course, if they refuse to pay back the IMF debt, Wall Street and the financial firms who have punished Argentina a great deal as well. But Cristina Kirchner was very frustrated because she felt that the great achievement of her husband of getting Argentine sovereignty back by getting them out of debt, that was being undermined, and that they shouldn't pay back a debt that was unlawful because Macri decided to take that loan out without asking Congress, it was unconstitutional. It was criminally funneled out of the country, and Christine Lagarde was practically living in Argentina. The former director of the IMF, of the International Monetary Fund, was practically living in Argentina, was constantly visiting Argentina during those years, and so this happened under her supervision. This crime was committed under her supervision, and so many of the followers of Cristina Kirchner felt that maybe, on second thought, they should not repay the debt. And that's when Alberto Fernandez began to ostracize and punish Cristina Kirchner. He refused, the feminist president, refused to defend this woman who was being very viciously persecuted by lawfare, very viciously persecuted, threatened with incarceration, illegally barred from re-election, and she would have probably won the re-election against Milei had she been able to run, but the president then allowed her to be humiliated by judges who are a kind of organized crime outfit in Argentina, and would not defend her, and have culminated in an assassination attempt. So Alberto Fernandez dressed up his capitulations to neoliberalism with progressive language, basically. That's what happened. I'm repeating myself, I'm sorry. I'm in Colombia now, by the way. I'm not right now in Buenos Aires. I'm in Medellin, Colombia.
I wanted to ask you, why did the center-left fail to maintain the support they gained after defeating Mauricio Macri in 2019?
Mauricio Macri.
Mauricio Macri, I'm sorry.
Why did they fail to regain?
Maintain the support they gained. Maintain the support.
Well, because people were, a big part of, the Macri era was a mix of inflation, economic depression, and the deterioration of civil liberties. For example, Macri had many rows and fights with the free press. He didn't like the press. He was very authoritarian. Macri spied on the families of a crew of, there was a submarine crew that drowned, and this was a cover-up because this was very embarrassing for a president who was very nostalgic about building back, rearming the military. And so he covered that up, and then when the families started to ask difficult questions in the press, something very similar, by the way, happened with Vladimir Putin when he was young. Macri sent, he began to surveil and spy illegally on these families, make recordings of them. And that's an example of the kind of authoritarianism that was very, very common in the Macri years. And so people expected the opposite of that when they voted left of Macri. They expected better civil liberties, freedom of speech, privacy, and more economic stability, and a ballsier administration that would stand up to the US. And for example, there was a plane from Venezuela during the Alberto Fernandez years that landed in Argentina. And suddenly a judge decided that because an Argentine judge decided that because politicians in the United States thought that plane should not be able to continue its flight, Alberto Fernandez couldn't make up his mind. He could not, say this is a matter of national security, and so the plane remained grounded for all those years into the Milei administration. So this lack of courage, this lack of, is a destruction of the image of Peronism, because Peronism was an ideology of outlaws, really. Peronism was an ideology of people who, especially before the dictatorship, when politics of the left and right was often determined by armed groups in the streets. Peronism was an ideology more of rebelliousness, whereas with the Fernandez years, it became the ideology of no smoking bans and let's see what this random municipal judge thinks here, and let's let's not, offend the business community, and so on. And so Peronism lost its spleen, its guts. That's what happened. I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself.
How has Milei's government and rhetoric been received by different social and economic groups in Argentina?
At first, they were euphoric. At first, they couldn't stop, popping the champagne. Now, they are confused because Milei happens to be very, very serious about all the nonsense that he spouts. Milei does not really understand the economic theories that he's espousing, all these Austrian thinkers, but he believes he does. And so recently, the rural landlords, who are the bedrock of every regime overthrow and coup in the history of Argentina, they are the sector that calls for military coups. They said they're very upset at Milei because he's not devaluing the currency, because they want the currency to be devalued, because he wasn't able yet to dollarize the economy. I don't think he'll be able to. But they want him to devalue the currency because they have their savings in dollars and they want to, it benefits them. But he's not doing it because he says no, because to devalue the currency, you need to print more money. And these Viennese Austrian economic theorists say that, and much of the right for a long time, also the right wing that justifies the murder of Salvador Allende, or they say that the root of all evil is printing too much money, right? Which is very comical because they love the United States, which has a kind of currency sovereignty. They print as much money as they like. But so Milei is sticking by his dogmas. He's very dogmatic, whereas they thought he'd be a complete and total puppet. And so they're upset at him now. And there was a desperate message sent, I think, by someone from Forbes or Bloomberg, who sent a video where he said, "This is a message for Milei. You must, we're very pleased with everything you've done, but you must be bold and dollarize now, abandon the peso and implement the dollar." So they're pleading with him to come through with some of his promises, and they're pleading with him to let go of certain other dogmas that he has advanced. And so they're confused by him because he is sincere. And I think that's one of the only things he has in common with historical fascists, is that he's very, very ideologically consistent.
Okay, looking ahead, I want to ask you, what are the potential long-term impacts of Milei's presidency on Argentina's political and economic landscape?
The long-term impact?
Yes.
Well, mass immigration is very harmful. Hunger. There is hunger. The house where I am sometimes, where my grandparents lived, is in a poorer area of Buenos Aires, and I sometimes look out my window and there is a man who's clearly starving to death. So the long term, it really depends on the dollarization scheme. I think the long-term effect is that he will be overthrown by his own support base in the right. The traditional right is upset with him. The military is alienated by him because he fetishizes Margaret Thatcher, whereas the military has a great wounds left by the war for the islands, the Falkland, the Malvinas. So I think that his grip on power is unstable. Depends. It's too nepotistic. He made his sister a very important state official. But in the long term, it will be mostly an intensified form of what Argentina has known in the past. And so I think that it will have very bad repercussions in the region because he supports people like Nayib Bukele, who and the Ecuadorian right wing. So that's harmful definitely regionally. Also, he's I think a major source of the support, the U.S. support for Javier Milei was about the dollar, because Brazil was threatening to create a unified Latin American currency called the sol, which would basically be like the Latin American version of the euro, and so that would weaken the dollar even more. And so, just as the Ukraine war temporarily improved the prospects of the dollar, Milei also, with his cult of the U.S. dollar, I think that I think it basically promotes fragmentation in the region. That's what it's basically doing.
One of the things you told us earlier is that you could explain some of the relationships between what's going on in Argentina to Venezuela. Can you elaborate in terms of some of those things?
Well, I think regionally, I mean, the traditional left does not any longer exist in Latin America after the death of Fidel, after the death of Chavez, and after the death of an entire generation of intellectuals and thinkers and poets who have been exiled. The traditional left is not really quite what it is, and so it's not. And so, even though Milei talks a lot about dollarization, you know who did do dollarization? Maduro did dollarization of the economy. Diaz-Canel did dollarization of the Cuban economy, and it's been catastrophic for Cubans. It's been terrible for Cubans. But the right wing wants to continue imagining, and also the left, the online left, wants to continue imagining that Cuba has a very left-wing government, and Diaz-Canel. And so I think that, I mean, the crisis now in Venezuela will be used by Milei like the same manner that's used by every single right-wing government. When the right-wing government is failing its population, it's very useful to point at the calamity affecting the Venezuelan people and to tell them, look, that's the alternative. Either you suffer with us or you end up like Venezuela. Of course, I think the Venezuelan political spectrum is actually unique in Latin America, because there's just a void of ideas and of both the opposition and the officialdom in Venezuela, Maduro party. They are, very, very impoverished intellectually. I'm talking about Maduro and the opposition, Carina. You won't find such a depressing, situation in any other Latin American country. There's a lack of seriousness that I think makes Venezuela more similar to some small Caribbean islands than to other countries in the continent, where the discourse, the level of discourse is more mature now. But, the ironic thing is that Maduro did push through dollarization, and Diaz-Canel did the same thing, which is a right-wing economic policy. And Cuba especially has damaged the population greatly. And so Milei rather ignored that and pretend that Cuba is still being ruled by this vampire phantom of Fidel Castro, and also people from the online left, like the Gray Zone, continue to defend Diaz-Canel as if he is Fidel Castro. So, if I may add something before, I think that's one interesting role the North American online left could do would be to provide a space for internal critics of the Latin American left. So young leftist exiles from Nicaragua, from Cuba, I mean, not exiles, but leftists in Cuba who are critical of the Diaz-Canel, who speak English. Maybe this could, shows like yours could form a peacemaking function within the Latin American left, because Latin American left-wing governments do pay attention to what the North American and European left is saying about them. And so maybe to create an alternative space where there could be more reflection and self-criticism, that would have a peacemaking effect that would more unify the Latin American left, create more dialogue, maybe. I just, shoved that in there, and it was not.
Arturo, well, I want to, you've really provided us a great deal of information. Do you think that what we are seeing right now bides very dangerously for the pink tide in Latin America? Is the left in danger in Latin America?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Boric is also an example of everything that was bad with the Fernandez administration. Boric is in Chile, neighboring country, is that times 10. It doesn't bode well. Lula also returns with restrictions on online speech because he decided to take up the discourse of post-January 6 Democrats, perhaps in the hope also to reach out to them. So Lula's crackdown on online speech, I think, is going to backfire in terms of popularity, and it's an example of Lula copying mistakes made by the Democrats in the United States. And no Latin American should be fooled for 1 second that January 6th at all compares to the terrible, brutal coups, military coups we had in Latin America, where the Air Force was bombarding the city squares of our own cities. That there's no comparison between America's January 6th and the Plan Condor. So I think these are very big ideological and strategic mistakes that are, I was very hopeful for Lula. I voted for Alberto Fernandez. I've always, whenever I could, I participate in demonstrations for the cause of memory about the dictatorship in Argentina. I am active. Here in Medellin also, the left is very much under attack. In Colombia, where I'm just visiting, I came here for the International Poetry Festival of Medellin. I represented Aruba. But I also, a few days ago, I went to a union, a political action to protect the street vendors of Medellin, which is being co-organized by a friend of mine whose house I am right now, and they tell me that it's very dangerous to be a young left-wing person in Colombia. It's very easy to get killed. Maybe there's a 5% chance of that, and so all of this paralysis, which is it's a mix of despair. It's a mix of having embraced the logic of there is no alternative, the logic of neoliberalism, a mix of having embraced a bit of an overdose of the new left values of identity politics, and of the worst of the new left values. Not, of course, the new left was also a time that I greatly admire of the great real anti-colonial revolutions, but of the 60s, but progressive 21st century political correctness is very bad. And yes, the pink tide is it's been mostly destroyed with the exception of Mexico and Brazil. I think it's mostly dead with the exception of Mexico and Brazil, and maybe Honduras.
Arturo, thank you so much for coming on our show. We would love to have you again on our guest to give us information as to what's going on in these areas. This is Revolution Podcast. Come check us out again. We will be back again with Jason Miles soon enough. And tomorrow night we have the Mile Hour. We will have Daniel Tutt. And we are out.
Thank you. Thank you very much.